This video is about the most inspirational, underestimated, and marginalized men in history. Thomas Paine essentially inspired the American independence, and as such, the creation of the United States of America during the Revolutionary War, 1776 to 1781. Thomas Paine, who inspired revolution both in the American colonies and France, had a background not typical of someone who would have such a profound impact on history. Thomas Paine was poorly educated with much of his youth, adulthood filled with job and marital failings. However, Thomas went on to essentially inspire success in a group of unlikely rebels to overthrow an empire undefeated at the time. That to me takes damn unique motivation. What could we learn about the origins of world-changing motivation to apply to ourselves? Here goes. Thomas Paine's journey began in 1737 in Thetford in Norfolk, England, when Thomas was born to Joseph and Frances Paine. Joseph Paine was a local tenant farmer, corset maker, and Quaker. The Quakers believed in equality and opposed hierarchy, corrupt establishment. The religious part of Tom Paine's background could have well influenced much of his activism and writings in later life. Thomas railed against church hierarchy and hated regular people being mistreated by those in power. Thomas also was aware of the class system that unofficially dominated life chances in Britain and Europe. Thomas Paine's father insisted that his son had an education in the essential English and math for a future clerk-type position in his later teens. Thomas Paine did have a sister, Elizabeth, but she died in childbirth, so Thomas was Joseph and Frances' only child. Tom grew up not in real poverty, such as historical winners like Abraham Lincoln, but it was low compared to born wealthy founding fathers of America like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Thomas at 13 became an apprentice to his father's corset-making business, which did not excite him. Think about the choices that Tom had growing up in an obscure class-based English small town, with the choice of corset-making under a pacifist. The becoming a revolutionary activist and author was not the obvious end result for Thomas Paine. I have observed and found practicing change through motivation is that it's all a choice to get and keep moving. The stories I followed are from 20th century fiction with characters like Rocky Balboa, who went from the boxing clubs of the back streets to the summit of his sport. Rocky kept getting knocked down only to keep getting back up. The story of Thomas Paine and the war for independence he arguably inspired is one of an underdog finding the reason and way to beat crazy odds, be it Rocky taking his shot at the championship with a poor record and not really having the necessary tools to win. Or a group of oppressed colonists, unhappy with the official rights of the English not applying to them going to war against an empire to achieve those rights and then some. It is arguable such ideas of rights, freedom, and taking a stand is inspired by seeing it done by others, like the character Rocky being inspired by Thomas Paine and the revolutionaries. Thomas Paine gained motivation for more than the family business. Yes, Tom had few choices growing up with the official rights from Magna Carta and Bill of Rights. The class system led him to continue the textile trade, not author trade, to London to work at a textile firm. Thomas had almost rejected his father's more passive Quaker religion for his mother's more fiery Anglican religion to fuel his activism motivation. Thomas, with this motivation, got involved in the textile pay disputes of the 1700s. Thomas Paine found himself at odds with established hierarchy and found his motivation to be involved in inspiring change there. Thomas grew up, yes, in class-based England, but on the heels of the European Reformation in the 16th century and later in the 17th century, the European Enlightenment. Thomas Paine's inspiration for activism and change did not just coincide with these movements. If Thomas Paine had been born in the 1300s, access to books and arguably inspiration for change would have been more scarce for his social class. The European Reformation and then European Enlightenment came within a century of each other. The Reformation inspired questioning of the Catholic Church, what was being taught. It was a reform of the existing church and Christian system. The Enlightenment inspired new ways of thinking about human potential and freedom. The Reformation also saw the mass printing of the Bible and books. The Reformation and Enlightenment led to the spreading of mass information and inspiring more people to learn and question the existing hierarchy. The Glorious Revolution had occurred in the 1600s in England and again was a protest, rebellion against the monarchy's total power and creating some separation from monarchy and parliament making laws and being more sovereign. The 1600s also saw the English Civil War, where the king was essentially removed for a period of time. Thomas Paine developed his motivation to make a stand against the system of class and the influence of the monarchy. Thomas was dismissed after the pay disputes at the textile firm, took a gamble as a privateer aboard a ship, which essentially was legalized pirate work. Thomas was able to amass considerable income from this venture. So Thomas learned about the benefit of risk-taking, a far cry from his life as a corset maker he left behind. After privateer work, Thomas Paine had the money to further develop his knowledge and reasoning skills by immersion in various books from Europe on politics, science, and philosophy in London bookstores. This kind of opportunity, as stated before, would not have been available to him 100 or especially 200 years ago. Many theories and ideas on the nature of life became available with recovered texts from early classical civilization with the aid of the Enlightenment. Thomas Paine's generation was a unique one in history, one in post- and pre-uprising, revolt and disillusionment with the people and the forces of class, religion, and monarchy that dominated much of the world, especially Britain, Europe, and with their colonies. This volatile time showed Thomas Paine that revolutionary change was possible, as uprisings have been happening over the past 200 years, and is further possible with the right kind of willingness to act. The enlightened times Tom lived in struck a chord with his own values attained from his Quaker father and more fierce Anglican mother, as well as inequalities he witnessed in English life with the class system at the heart of society. At the time was a rise in the self-made middle-class men who were more questioning of the established aristocracy, who had a monopoly on trade going back to the manor system of early capitalism. With inspiration coming from the Enlightenment with the books on philosophy, politics, and science to question the established world order. Tom was actively involved in this movement post-privateer days. The money started to run out, and Thomas Paine had to leave the sanctuaries of new thinking to his old trade in corset making again. It's back on the beat, back to the start, trusting your heart to quote Rocky V's end song performed by Elton John, The Measure of a Man. The Kent corset shop had to close down due to poor sales performance. To top this adversity off, he had married and his wife was pregnant. However, she and the baby died in childbirth. Tom was heartbroken, but found the will to keep going. He had previous wins that for some people is enough proof the struggle is worth it. Thomas Paine contacted his dad, and his father used his connections to get Tom a job in civil service working in the customs department back in his hometown of Thetford. Tom would check cargo, collect excise, tax collect, and prevent corruption. This job and a bunch of other type of civil service jobs did not appeal to Tom for obvious reasons. He campaigned for better working conditions and pay. He was terminated officially for different reasons. He appealed and won the appeal, showing his personal motivation and empowerment. Thomas got posted in Lewes in Sussex, which had a history of pro-Oliver Cromwell and anti-monarchy sentiment, a perfect place for Tom with his feelings towards the monarchy and aristocrat establishment. Thomas joined local committees, including local government executive and local Anglican vestry, which collected taxes to distribute among the poor. Thomas Paine's landlord, Samuel Olive, who introduced him to a debating club called the Society of 12, who discussed issues important to the town. Sources state Tom presented well-reasoned arguments. This can be argued to be Tom's calling in life, forming ideas, counter-ideas, and rhetoric. Why should the system work as it does? Why, if born to this family, should you have more access and rights? Tom had established his calling in life. Thomas Paine married his landlord's daughter, Elizabeth Olive. This marriage ended in divorce by 1774. Thomas was still working in excise and was increasingly becoming irritated by pay and working conditions. Tom was making himself become known with the printing of thousands of leaflets to lobby globalist Parliament for change. Thomas was fired coincidentally after lobbying Parliament for better pay and being better positioned for rooting out corruption. Thomas had to sell possessions to avoid going to debtor's jail. Yes, a thing that was around back in the 1700s. The political activism did appear to take its toll on his regular life, with business failing and divorce. With the divorce settlement of £40 and business building going to Elizabeth. Thomas Paine, divorced and jobless, traveled to London and through a former debate club member, George Lewis Scott, was introduced to future founding father Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was impressed by the rhetoric and advocacy of Thomas Paine and wrote him a letter of recommendation to travel and work in America. The rest is world-changing history. Prior to leaving, Thomas Paine, along with Franklin, had attended Newington Green Unitarian Church, which was formed by Protestants in 1708 and had pro-Republican sentiments. There was strict monarchy state restrictions of non-Church of England religions in the 1700s. Thomas Paine was not the only free thinker fleeing to the New World following the Pilgrim Fathers of 1620. The teachings of Reverend Price not only was followed in the New World, but somewhat affected practices in England like abolishment of slavery, women's right to vote. Thomas Paine sailed to Philadelphia and, despite getting sick on the voyage, arrived in 1774. After recovering from typhoid, Thomas Paine took jobs as school teachers and met a migrant who bound books. Thomas noticed that far too many publications concentrated on Britain rather than domestic affairs. Thomas would write in the Pennsylvania Magazine and would in time use it to communicate issues on worker rights and general freedoms. Literacy rates were predicted to be higher in the colonies than that of Britain at the time, which led to successful and wide magazine circulation. Thomas Paine had established his communication and motivation for change calling and was finally in the right country. Thomas Paine attracted attention of those with revolt against the globalist crown in England. Benjamin Rush was one such people. Although Thomas Paine disliked the involvement of the founders' involvement in land gentry, he found common ground on liberties, which was felt to not being adhered to in the colonies. So, in the aftermath of the start of the Revolution, Thomas Paine was a writer, and with various influences published Common Sense, which led to the Declaration of Independence. It inspired sign-ups and motivated the revolutionaries to fight the lackeys of the crown. When all seemed lost by December 1776, with more battles lost than won by the Washington's troops and recruitment down. One last-ditched attempt by Washington was motivated by Thomas Paine's new published article, American Crisis, which was read to his troops. Washington took his motivated but tired, hungry, and cold troops across the freezing Delaware River and surprised the Hessian mercenary crown lackeys and started a series of military comebacks which led to winning the war in 1881. Thomas Paine's activism continued with his published work of the Rights of Man in 1791. He embodied new ways of thinking and found motivation with various wins and defeats throughout his life. The journey he took was more relevant than his ending. It shows that it does not matter where you start, but where you finish. Thanks for watching. Please leave a comment. Please like and subscribe.